Chris Gammell, head of developer relations and hardware at Golioth. Golioth's a SaaS IoT platform. We'll hear a little bit more about it later, but glad to be here. And thanks for the invite.
Hey, and I'm Mark. I'm the Director of Engineering and GM at Marcus Engineering. We're a end-to-end product development firm for medical devices and other things. I think we'll
They make great stuff. Great stuff.
so we'll start off with the main topic today, which is what does cybersecurity regulations require? And we want to talk about not what do they require from a regulatory perspective, but what do they require from an engineering perspective. Lots of people think mainly about this kind of compliance as a regulatory activity, and they don't think about the engineering implications. So we're going to talk a little bit about what are the engineering requirements that this compliance drives, and what happens when you try to do it all yourself.
Are you saying we shouldn't wait all the way till the end when we talk to our regulatory people in-house and then start thinking about the design elements, Mark?
Yeah, exactly. That's
Yeah.
when you get into trouble. That's when you
Yeah,
add
that'll
a whole bunch of new engineering requirements
that
right at
Gantt
the end.
chart just goes like this. Yeah.
We'll start with the FDA, everybody's favorite regulatory agency, and talk about what they require for these kinds of devices. So the first thing is I like to talk a little bit about the regulatory authority. So Section 524B of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act gives them the legal mandate to regulate this, and it went into force in March 23. And so all devices since then have needed to comply with this. And really the people who need to comply are devices that qualify as a cyber device. So a cyber device is a very broad term. They have this three-part test in the regulations. Includes software, has the ability to connect to the internet, and could be vulnerable to cybersecurity threats. So we'll talk about what they mean by that. So these first two are the easiest ones. Include software. This is pretty straightforward. This also includes subassemblies. So if you're like, oh, I didn't write any software, if you included something with software, it's your product, it's your responsibility. There's no free pass because it's just like something you bought from someone else. And the last one, vulnerable to cybersecurity threats. This is everything, all software. So these two requirements are basically the same. The last one, the most complicated one, is has the ability to connect to the internet. This is really, really broad. They include what I like to call second hop connectivity. So this is basically, could any interface on your product be connected to a device that's connected to the internet? And this drives if you need to comply. So we'll go through. I have some examples. I'll ask you guys to. So let's see. So if we have a Bluetooth IoT device, I'll ask you guys to raise your hand if you think this is a if this can connect to the internet. I'll give you guys a few seconds to think about it. All right. So yes, this can connect to the internet. All right. So here's the next one.
Mark, is that second hop because Bluetooth in that
Yes, that's
case?
exactly
Would you
right. Yep.
consider
So
that? Yeah. Okay.
your Bluetooth device could connect to your phone, for example, which is connected to the internet.
Got it. Yep.
Let's see. What about a defibrillator with an external USB port? Raise your hand if you think this could connect to the internet. All right, I'll give you everybody a few more seconds here. Yes, you can plug this into a computer. It can connect to the internet too. All right, we'll move on. This one's more hard. A bone growth stimulator with a factory serial port. Who thinks this can connect to the internet? Raise your hand. Give everybody a few more seconds. Believe it or not, yes, this can plug into a computer, which can be connected to the internet. All right. What about a bone growth simulator with a factory-only serial port with a cover that needs a tool to remove? Can this connect to the internet? Is this a cyber device under the FDA? Give everybody a few more seconds. Yeah, turns out it's on the border, but probably. I have seen situations where this counts as a cyber device. They interpret this unbelievably broadly. The current
That was
guidance,
kind of a trap, though, Mark. I'm just gonna say. I mean, I'm just gonna call it out. That was. Come on,
and
man.
that's the trap I see everybody, all
Yeah.
lots of our clients fall into, is they go to the FDA and they're like, "Yep, this is a cyber device," and they're like, "Ah," and so their
So
guidance.
the
Oh,
best
good.
post that I saw about this was, is your device made out of solid wood? If yes, it's not a cyber device. If no, it's probably a cyber device.
Oh my.
So
Exactly.
wooden tongue depressors are not cyber devices. Everything else is.
My favorite is
Got it.
a thermometer, serial port, cyber device. Um,
Wow.
and so it's, does this device contain any external wired or wireless communication interfaces? That's what's on the FDA's refuse to accept checklist. Where that's the checklist that they use to evaluate whether your 510K is going to get kicked back. And then you get one of those nice templated form letters where they check the boxes and give you lots of paragraphs of information. Um, and so, of course, what we often see is people say, "Oh, I already have my 510K. I don't need to worry about this." Turns out, still need to comply. All devices, even with 510Ks already issued, need to comply for this. The place where this comes up is usually when you are making a change that requires a refile of a 510K. Um, a substantial change, and you come back and you're like, oh, great, I only added this new mode. Here's all my clinical data. And they're like, that's awesome. Where's all your cybersecurity compliance? And you're like, this was made 20 years ago. That they are going to require all of this information. So there are 5 top engineering requirements that the FDA has that are going to blow up your budget. Um, and we'll go through them one by one. So the first one is updatability, patchability. The FDA requires rapid, secure verification, validation, and distribution of patches and updates. Um, this this isn't, oh, we'll send a technician out the field, we'll send it back to the factory, all that kind of stuff. Sending it back to the factory is not going to cut it. This is not going to meet the requirements of the FDA. You need this to be a feature in your product to allow you to meet this requirement for rapid, secure verification, validation, and distribution. We've often seen products who can't, for example, do secure updates because they can't run the cryptography required to meet the current best standards. We've seen products that don't have interfaces or software support, and it would be more complicated than the entire product, blowing up their development timeline and budget to add this to their product. Um, the next one here is logging and intrusion detection. So the FDA requires you to be able to detect, recognize, log, notify people, and act upon anomalous conditions during normal use. And the main reason for this is because, in addition to all of the safety reasons that you're probably already thinking about, it's to identify cyber events, to figure out, have people been interacting with my device in an unexpected way that could indicate that they've compromised it, they could compromise it, they're sniffing around, that kind of stuff. Or to say, hey, all of a sudden my devices are doing something weird, which could indicate a compromise is going on. They're operating 10 times as much as they should be. They're um, being used in the middle of the night when there never were before. Those kinds of things. Those are all the kinds of things that they want. And people often say, "Oh, we'll ask our field sales reps to do this." And I saw something weird 6 months ago. When you ask the doctors this question and you document it, that's not going to cut it. That does not meet the requirements of this. It needs to be automated. It needs to be detailed record keeping to meet these requirements. Um, the next one is authentication. So they require that you use NIST compliant mutual authentication and encryption for all external connections. Um, this means that you can't just, uh, some people are like, oh, used a CRC to check if the packet's messed up, or we used we plugged it into a device with a special connector so nothing else can plug in, or we own the server, that kind of thing. Those will not meet these requirements. You have to use the current best NIST standards for all of your authentication, all your encryption, everything for your external connections. And this often drives the hardware and software for your product. If you made decisions early in your design about, I'm going to use this really great, cheap, small microcontroller, and it's connecting externally, those devices may not be powerful enough to run the required encryption, authentication algorithms, that kind of stuff. And the next one, access control. So they require you to enforce access controls for different users, like doctors, patients, and manufacturers. So your manufacturer settings, things that should never be changed except by the OEM, cannot be accessible to your doctors. And things like patient settings can't change stuff that a doctor should only be able to change. And one thing I see is I buried it in the settings. I buried it in the settings is not going to cut it. That does not meet the FDA's requirements for enforcing the right access control, enforcing the right separation of responsibilities. And the last one of the most important ones, is integrity. And this requires you to make sure that your device, the boundary of it, that the whole design has not been breached, has not been tampered with, people haven't opened it up and done something. They require secure boot, they require tamper resistance, both physical and electronic, and they require unique cryptographic keys. And they also require the ability to do secure backup and restore of settings. You need to be able to get the device back to the state that it was in from the factory without the possibility that it's been tampered with. And my favorite is, no one's going to bother. People say, well, my device is only an X. No one's going to bother opening it up to do something bad. Or another one is, well, in the instructions for use, we put, keep it in a secure area of the hospital. That's not going to cut it. The FDA requires you to consider the hospital, the networks, to be a hostile place. It's not a safe place. All right, so we're also going to talk about a couple of other security schemes around the world that require security for IoT devices. There are a couple more. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Cyber Resilience Act. So this is actually in the EU, and so it grants the EU member states the legal mandate to regulate cybersecurity. And this is going to go into force in December of 2027. And so this applies to all products, with some caveats, sold in the EU with a digital element capable of processing, storing, or transmitting digital data. Another one of those really broad, vague definitions that I love so much. And a direct or indirect connection to a device or network. Just another one of those great regulatory activities. This doesn't apply generally to products that already have their own separate cybersecurity regulations. So the big ones are medical, automotive. There are a couple of other more niche ones that have little carve-outs for the CRA. But other than that, every device sold in the EU is going to need to comply with this. All consumer devices, industrial, that kind of stuff. And it's going to drive similar complexities and rework to the medical regulations.
Yeah, I think there's also different tiers of punishment, punitive actions, based on like how much they're charging, like for violations and stuff like
Yes.
that. But I think medical for sure is like way up there. Medical infrastructure, stuff like that.
And like you said, the way they do all of their regulations now is as a fraction of your revenue for the income. So it's not you can't have large companies that are like, oh, $100,000 fine, whatever. It's a cost of doing business. it's much more extreme. So we'll talk about the applicability. So if it has software, it's a digital element. If you're wondering, is this a digital element? The answer is yes. The second one, a direct or indirect connection, is they define connection as using physical means through electrical, optical, mechanical interfaces, wires, or radio waves. So this probably includes things like smoke signaling as direct or indirect connections. So this is basically almost anything. So if you're saying, gosh, I want to make my device not require compliance to the CRA, you are trying to fly a very narrow keyhole. And so I won't go through all their requirements, but it turns out they're actually extremely similar to the FDA's requirements, the CRA. They require a couple of things like secure by default. It has to ship in a configuration that is secure, and it has to be able to have those reset functions. It has to have access control, encryption, integrity, all the same stuff. They require you to limit the attack surface specifically. And they also require auto updates, slightly more strong than the FDA. And they also require you to have strong, clear mechanisms to disable those updates as well. All right, so now we'll move on to the UK PSTI. And so it's similar, the Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure Act. And it grants their regulatory offices the legal mandate to regulate cybersecurity. And this is actually already in force in the UK. It went into force April 2024. And it applies to products sold in the UK that directly connect to the internet or that use a protocol that can connect two or more products at the same time. And directly connect to the internet, they actually define this in a peculiar way. They define this as products that use any of these connectivity protocols at all, any TCP, UDP, that kind of stuff. So even if it's internal, you actually still fall under this. And this connecting two or more of the devices is more narrow than the other ones, than the CRA, the FDA, that kind of stuff. It basically includes most wireless protocols, Bluetooth, Zigbee, that kind of stuff. The only things it excludes, it's really trying to exclude stuff like USB, where you're connecting directly from one thing to another, and you can't connect to multiple things at the same time as part of the protocol. And so it's actually quite narrow. It doesn't have any login intrusion detection requirements. There's no access control requirements, no integrity requirements. They have just a couple of narrow requirements, is that you have to clearly publish a fixed end date for security updates, and you have to make that understandable. And once you announce that, you can't shorten it. However, that the amount of time you patch and update it can be 0. You just have to declare that up front. Hey, my product will never receive security updates is valid under this law. You just have to tell people that. You have to provide a vulnerability reporting program, and you have to have passwords. And really, the main requirement is it can't be derived from your serial number, things like that. So compared with the FDA and the CRA, the PSTI is actually quite light. The last one that we're going to talk about today is the Cyber Trust Mark. This is the US program similar to those two. And so the FTC already has the authority to create this voluntary cybersecurity program. And so it's kind of been pushed back a couple of times. It's expected to start around early 2026. Some people will sell you late 2025. I think that's unlikely. And the executive order that put this into place says that they will only buy Cyber Trust Mark certified IoT devices starting in 2027. I think those kinds of things have been flexible over time. So we'll see if and when that comes into force. But that's one of the forcing functions for why people would want to use this voluntary compliance program for their products. And so the Cyber Trust Mark applies to consumer products only that are interconnected and have at least one sensor or actuator interacting with the physical world, which is quite an interesting requirement. Internet connected is defined pretty narrowly in this case. They don't include the same second hop or could connect to something else. It's just, is your device talking to the internet? It's, like I said, it's optional. There's no requirement that you have this, except for that requirement that's expected to go into force to sell these kinds of products to the US government. Sensor and actuator are actually pretty defined. They reference the NIST standard for those. And so sensor is capable of providing an observation of the physical world, and an actuator is capable of changing something in the physical world. I think this actuator definition is quite broad. For example, if I store something on a hard drive, did that change something in the physical world? Because it's physically stored. I don't know, but it seems very broad. It's based on compliance with the NIST cybersecurity standards for the minimum requirements for IoT. And so it does require updatability, patchability. It does require logging. It has less strict intrusion detection requirements. It requires the same strong authentication, access control. And for integrity, they don't require the same level of compliance and complexity as the FDA or the CRA. You only have to document your integrity and how you decided to do that, but your documentation could say, we decided to do a bad job, and that's acceptable as long as you communicate that. All right, I'll hand over to Chris to talk about IoT.
Sure, yeah. So I mentioned at the beginning, Golioth is an IoT SaaS platform. So we have white label, we have enterprise instances as well, especially for more sensitive applications like medical, things like that. But generally, every day I talk to devices that are cellular, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, all of these different things, and these are all usually in a consumer context usually called IoT. But if you go to the next slide, I usually just call them connected devices, and that is kind of a relevant thing in this discussion here, because as Mark said, it is much broader than just the traditional IoT things, right? Usually it's, when I define IoT, it's usually a fleet of sensors that might be spread out over a factory, a field, depending on your application space. They're all talking back to the cloud. You're collating that data in a database. Then you're using that for some kind of collective intelligence for tracking trends over time or taking action based on that. So we have many users that are doing things like HVAC monitoring, temperature, coil currents, things like that. But ultimately, it's to save money. It's to introduce new features to users, things like that. In a medical context, it's often much broader than that, and it's more of the Golioth being a device management solution as well. Usually those sorts of things start to get into that space as well. So Golioth being a platform that can talk down to the various types of devices that are out there, but then do other things like over-the-air updates, command and control, collecting data, all of these different things here. So next slide, please. One thing, I'm a hardware person myself. I do a lot more firmware these days, and I am very capable of connecting things to the internet now. But thinking about me from 5 years ago to me today, in the past, 5 years ago, me would have just been like, well, look, there's a modem on board, I'm set, right? I've got a Wi-Fi modem, a cellular modem, a Bluetooth module, whatever it is. It's just not enough, right? If you need to do all of the things that we're talking about here, you really need to be pulling all of these decisions forward and be thinking about them at the beginning of your process as you're planning out your entire system architecture. Because often the ability, it's not something you can just kind of chuck over the wall to the software folks or even just the firmware folks. You need to really be thinking about, how does my cloud talk all the way down to my device? And I'm not just saying this as a person who works at a cloud company. Regardless of what service you use, you need to be thinking about how you're going to be structuring all this stuff, how you're pulling in all these features in order to make a accessible device, especially when it is a constrained device, right? So something super low power, something that is cost constrained, that sort of thing. The complexity is often lurking below the surface, and as Mark and his whole team could tell you, it's the things you don't know about that are really gonna bite you later. And so thinking about an IoT system, you need to be thinking holistically. You need to try and prototype all the way up the stack, all the way back down, especially so that you understand kind of where the pitfalls are. Next slide, please. One thing we've been kind of talking about here is kind of IP devices, right? So like Mark's slides talked about, some of the regulations talk about things that are kind of on the broader internet or even on private, VPNs, things like it. Those are talking over internet protocol, right? UDP, TCP, all of these different layers of the stack that might be there. If they're talking back to, for example, a cellular device, a Wi-Fi device that's talking back to the Golioth cloud, those are IP devices. I can directly talk to them, either public or private IP addresses, depending on where they are in the ecosystem. But these are what I call IP devices, and it's that's really going to be if you're on the broader internet. Not just saying you have open ports for everything that anybody can talk to you, but even like a cellular device, I could. It has a private IP address, usually behind a cellular NAT server, and I can't necessarily tunnel to that and see that. It's not like it's out there, but there's additional scrutiny overall because you need to then kind of get out to an additional server from there. And so that's really something you need to be thinking about if you are at that level. I have the feeling that, just from the complexity of the medical space, it's not as common of a thing, because then you have to deal with, cellular data plans. You need to deal with IT groups inside hospitals. Really, it does ramp up your complexity even more. And so that's why, at least from my experience, I've seen a lot of, connected devices that are Bluetooth devices. That is a much more common thing that I've seen in the medical space. Obviously not true across all devices. Next slide, please. So non-IP, right? This would be things that are not directly accessible from an IP address. So something like a Bluetooth device is a good example. It has to talk through a phone. It's that second hop, like Mark talked about. But that then adds additional complexity when you are trying to add other features, right? So now you're trying to push a firmware update down to a Bluetooth device. Well, first you have to push it to the phone, and then the phone has to push it down to the various devices that are there. And so this is actually a new paradigm that Golioth is working on, really just thinking about non-IP communication. So it doesn't have a direct IP, it's not talking over IP, that's fine. But you could still implement a lot of these updates. You can still talk over the wire for connected devices. These are still connected to the internet, as the definition says, but this new pouch paradigm at Golioth basically allows us to talk to things that are like Bluetooth or serial or CAN or all the different things that are out there that are not necessarily IP, but they are still connected back to the cloud somehow, often through that second hop. And so we can start thinking about it and how we can implement some features that make it easier to comply with a lot of these regulations. Things like over-the-air updates for firmware updatability, and things like command and control and collecting data. So all of these different things there. So this is just something I wanted to mention because, if you start thinking about it, if we just accept the fact that connected devices are connected regardless of whether or not they're IP, that you could start to implement additional both cloud and device side capabilities that make it easier to comply with regulations later. That when you come to the documentation time, you can also start to point to these capabilities and say, hey, I can update this even though it's a Bluetooth device or even though it's a CAN device because I have A, B, C, and D in place. I think that's it on these slides. I think it's into the, is that it, Mark?
Oh, we have this one more, what this means for you.
Yeah, got it. Yes. This is the point I was already making there. But, if you want to lower your operational overhead, thinking about this sort of thing, this not, accessing non-IP devices, having some schema, some paradigm for talking to them, being able to update them. I think updates are probably the most important thing in this context. Probably the toughest to do end to end. And thinking about that up front is really going to save you a lot of headaches later, because building that custom from scratch, as we're going to talk about here in a second, that's where you really start to, how hard could it be? Very hard is the answer. And you don't want to figure that out 3 years later.
All right. So we'll talk about some examples of what happens when you do it yourself. So I think if you're an engineer who hasn't worked on this before, or if you're working with some engineers who have not worked on these kinds of systems before, like Chris said, it's actually surprisingly challenging. it seems so tantalizingly easy to add these features yourself. We'll just implement them, we'll design them, that kind of stuff. It's actually the complexity of adding all these features can often exceed the complexity of your whole device itself. And so we have some examples about when people did a bad job or did it themselves and what those implications and outcomes were. And we have a mix of mostly medical devices, but also some other IoT devices to get a little bit broader scope. So the first one is the, a few years ago, some of you may be familiar with the Abbott. They have these RF pacemakers. And so these are, implantable class 3 devices. And they ship these without a path for secure update. This wasn't really part of their design. It wasn't considered in their implementation. And so they had about 465,000 of these implanted in the world when these vulnerabilities surfaced. And these vulnerabilities could allow people to remotely change settings, disrupt them, cause serious patient harm. And when they did these updates, they had to be done in a clinician's office or in an inpatient setting on a cardiac monitor. And one of the reasons for that is because they evaluated there's a 1 in 30,000 risk of complete functionality loss to the device doing this update. And so for those of you doing the math at home, that means that they expected 14 of these across their fleet, 14 of these implanted devices to completely stop working. If you're talking about I didn't implement firmware update, or my firmware update process wasn't tested, and all of a sudden now 14 people have to have surgery or could have a serious risk of injury just from your update, then that's a really you're not doing a good job implementing secure update.
Yeah, I always think about the fact, I'll ship something out. It's, out in the field somewhere. It's like, oh, I got to drive out there. A little bit different than if you have to
open the
get it
chest
out.
cavity. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a. Yeah. So just as a reminder, this is the regulatory need, right? Devices must detect, recognize, log, notify, and respond to anomalies during. This looks like this is the wrong one. Sorry, this was copy pasted wrong. My bad. This is basically the ability to update. I must have copy pasted the wrong one here. But basically, you need to be able to securely send updates down to the devices. Basically, at Golioth, we have an OTA service. This is something that is part of our device side SDK and our cloud service. So, you go and try out the Golioth firmware SDK, you put it on your device. It's basically already there, registering, listening for updates. The Golioth cloud says, if you register with version 1.0.0, up to the cloud, and now 1.0.1 is available, it'll send a notification out of the device. The device then starts to fetch that. And, just the ability to do that, this is often a thing that people say, I will get to this someday. And often it's at the end of a project, and it can be detrimental for thinking about this sort of thing. And so thinking about this with both a, not just a cellular device, a Bluetooth device, a CAN device, anything across the range, even a serial device, the ability to go as soon as it plugs in, as soon as it talks to anything, it's able to go and query whether it has the latest, whether it's been updated. And we have something called cohorts to be able to do groups of devices. So, you might have a set of test devices that don't want to get the latest firmware update because it's still in test. That's fine. You can mark certain devices as the test group, or then more widely roll them out to all devices. It is all based on versioning. And then in terms of how it actually, make sure that it is a good update, it uses something called MCU boot on Zephyr at least, and it pulls down the binary, puts it into memory, tries to boot up. If it doesn't work, it reverts back to the last one. And so there's also support for signed firmware images. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the integrity group of things.
And I think one of the things you have to do is you have you can do the slow rollout of your updates as well, right?
That's right. Exactly. Yep.
And that's,
so you could have stage rollouts using cohorts, that sort of thing. It's all scriptable. So basically, if you had 1,000 devices, you only say the first 5 are going out to the test group that's in the lab, and then the next 20 are going out to the group that's within a known beta tester group that have opted in, that sort of thing.
And I think one of the things is that we've seen with people who do firmware update is they roll it themselves, they get it out, and without those kinds of features, that slow rollout, you can press a button, deploy to all 1,000 devices, and only then realize there's a problem where it breaks your firmware update or something like that, and now
Right, exactly.
you've broken your whole fleet all at once.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Test. That is an important piece there, and there's a lot of tooling around it as well in terms of automation, and but ultimately you need your engineers looking at it, double checking on things, both from their own code, but also from just the deployment and making sure that everything's healthy as the OTA rolls out. And OTA, just again, is over the air. Sorry about that. That's over the air updates with firmware updates effectively. Yes.
And so next we have the logging intrusion detection. So Verta is a camera IoT system. And I like this example because they had attackers access more than 150,000 cameras. You can see a tweet here from one of the attackers. Here's a screenshot of a camera in Cloudflare's HQ. So they didn't have any anomaly alerts. They didn't have the right reporting to detect this. And so they figured out they were under attack when the screenshots hit Twitter. And I hope that none of you guys find out that your devices are under attack from Twitter. And this is one of the reasons why this kind of logging intrusion detection is so critical. The FDA wants you to, and the EU regulatory authority, the FCC, they want you to know early and often if something is going to happen. Nothing's ever perfect. And that's the reason why they want you to detect this stuff. They want you to be able to rapidly create patches, update, that kind of thing. If it takes you a year to walk out to every hospital and update stuff, you're not going to stop an attacker.
Yeah, I believe the CRA also has a reporting requirement back to the central authority as well that they're still working through.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so this is the correct regulatory need. You must detect, notify, log, notify, and respond to anomalies during normal operation. All right, there we go. Yes, and so in terms of things that we have available, obviously not the only ones out there, but logging. So we have a logging subsystem, basically. So if you have a Zephyr device, like this is a Zephyr device right here, Zephyr has a logging subsystem there. You can actually tie that into the Golioth backend. We then compress that data. We send that up to the cloud. So much like you might have logging go out to a serial port, which you are definitely turning off in production because you want to make sure you're secure there. You can also have that logging sent to the cloud. You can then also turn it down so that you're not sending as much data. You can selectively say what is or isn't sending data up to the cloud. That's from a warning, error, debug, info logging kind of paradigm there. But that's one way that you can do logging and intrusion detection. Just am I seeing anomalies on different devices? You can then send that out to other services. You can just look at the device records and say, this device here had a particular debug error that's unexpected. I might go and take action on that. Probably more likely, though, is something like a custom pipeline. So Golioth also has the idea of a stream. So a device might be streaming normal sensor data up, right? If this is just a temperature sensor, it might be streaming the temperature up to the cloud. Well, you might also have something like a light sensor on board. And when the case has been opened, you can detect light onto that sensor, send that on a different path that we call it. So like a topic, but really a different path. So you might have just a path like light detected. You send that data up to the cloud, and then you can start to take action on that, right? So that pipeline, you then set up a pipeline so that can go out to different notification services. You could do collate the data over time using AI services and things like that for anomaly detection. But ultimately, you can have different paths of sending different data, maybe normal and out of band type of data, and then you can take action on that on the cloud side.
I think it's so important to look at this data and get it out into other services, and all those integrations, that setup, that's all so challenging. And lots of people are like, oh, it's only one more thing. And well, if it takes a week to do one more thing and you have 10 one more things, all of a sudden you're missing your ship deadlines, you're missing your regulatory deadlines, that kind of stuff.
Yes. Yeah, on the pipeline side as well, really, that is like I kind of think about it like a switchboard, or like a, kind of directing fire hoses towards different places. You might be sending it to a, Amazon queuing service, right? That's a common destination for data that's flowing out, just like that temperature data is flowing out to the Amazon queuing service for the normal type of operation. But in, the out of band type of thing, like you detect light on a sensor and it goes the out of band path. Well, that might go to something like I forget the, like a webhook out to a notification service, that sort of thing. And then you can immediately get a phone call, get a text, get a Slack message, all of the different things that you can do for immediate action. And that's all configurable cloud side with pipelines.
And I hope your immediate action doesn't come from your Twitter. So
Yeah, right. Don't send it to Twitter.
all right, so another one's authentication. So the Medtronic MiniMed insulin pump, and I kind of did them dirty. This is an image of their newer product. Couldn't find any images of their older products. So these remote pumps had an unauthenticated RF interface, and so attackers could silently overdose on insulin. There are some details about exactly when and where and how, but it was definitely common enough that the FDA issued a recall with around 64,000 units affected. And the core reason for this is because they did not have the proper authentication. They did not have the proper anti-replay. They did not have the proper, connectivity to make sure that messages were only sent by an authorized source. And so then you could silently overdose on insulin, issue 100, 1,000 times the recommended dose and cause the potential for serious injury and harm to your users.
Yep. So mutual authentication and NIST compliant encryption for all external communications. I think in this case, I mean, like that example that Mark just said is like that was just an open channel, right? I mean, that was like someone was, re-hitting the garage door kind of button. That sounds like what that was.
Yep.
That's kind of a true open channel. So not that common, but even I think as you go, as you kind of move up the stack, you send, broader and broader communication, command and control back down to devices. You need to have even stronger encryption because it's just on the broader internet. And
actually, one of the MiniMed and some other ones, they had some examples where even they had strong encryption, but they didn't have we call this anti-replay. So you could
replay attacks.
Get this same. You record a message, very similar to some garage door attacks. You record a message that says, "Oh, administer insulin." I just play that back 20 times in a row really fast, and all of a sudden I've done 20 times more insulin. And even though that message was signed and authenticated, there weren't the proper mechanisms that NIST, really smart people have thought about how do we prevent these kinds of attacks. So you can't play the same message over and over.
Yeah, you talk to a security researcher, first thing they're doing is a replay attack. Like that is like the beginning of their toolkit for sure. And so in terms of what we do, basically you cannot, so say you are a device talking to the cloud. In this case, this is a cellular device, for instance. This cannot talk to the cloud without it being encrypted traffic. Basically, every packet is encrypted. There's no way to peek into it unless you have the keys for that. And we have both PSK support, that's pre-shared keys, that's mutual, and then there's certificate support as well. We are working on but we're working on some even more complex stuff as well, and we do work with PKI providers. Basically, thinking about this, where you want to be, again, you use Golioth, you don't use Golioth. You want to make sure that your traffic is encrypted. I once talked to a cellular provider, and they said, "Well, we don't encrypt our packets because we're on a private network for cellular, and we want to save data." And it's like, okay, that's great, but that's actually not like it's not that hard to view cellular traffic. It's not common, but it's not that hard to do that. And then once they get through these various layers of communication, if you get to the end packet and that's just not encrypted at all, that's basically leaving the front door open. And so, yes, we are definitely very focused on security and making sure that everything's sent up that is encrypted. I mentioned the non-IP stuff as well. We have some certificate-based auth on Bluetooth devices. So again, you can rely on something like a secure Bluetooth channel. We're not relying on that. We're saying that a packet sent from a Bluetooth device through a standard gateway up to Golioth, that first packet has to be encrypted cloud down to device before it can be sent for all these channels. That's really what Pouch is doing. Pouch is wrapping it up with an additional layer of encryption. It transits through trusted or semi-trusted gateways all the way up to the cloud. But because the cloud has the keys and the device has the certificate that was generated from those keys, and again, we don't own those keys. That's something like a PKI provider can hold for you. Ultimately, that is that piece of device that's transited through trusted or untrusted all the way up. It's still encrypted from cloud to device.
So the next one we talk about is access control. So this is the Contech CMS 800. It's a patient monitor, and what happened was network users' permissions were not locked down. They weren't restricted to only what should be able to be accessed. They weren't restricted to accessing the things that were required. They allowed you to get unlimited access to the machine, and then using those credentials that were only intended to be used for a limited set of functionality, you can now export patient health information. You can now remotely control the device. You could upload new firmware that lied to the providers about the patient's health state. And this was actually subject of an urgent coordinated disclosure by CISA and the FDA. I sincerely hope that none of you have your devices be subject to an urgent coordinated disclosure of CISA and the FDA. You can have a bad time.
Yes, and so you must enforce access controls for different stakeholders, and this device, the Contech device specifically, basically having full permissions for any user, that's a no-no. But even just thinking about what your device can do is potentially problematic. So device side, most of the time, say you had a connected device that's on Golioth, but you had like an admin menu on it, maybe a little screen. If you have no limited controls there for the UI, for whatever the button interface is there, ultimately that is for the device manufacturer, right? You have to have some kind of way to do that. There's nothing that Golioth does on that side of things, but we do have what's called setting service. And so if you wanted to basically have everything locked down until the cloud side talks down through the various layers to the device and says only unlock when the cloud says it's unlocked, because you have some kind of, maybe the key card scan, or you have a device side password, or some kind of other authentication mechanism that's for the user based on their permissions, right? So, Dr. Jones is, trying to access the IP stack on this tiny device here. Well, he has to go to his, Microsoft server to say that he's allowed to do that. Then it talks to Golioth. Then it unlocks the setting all the way down to the device, right? That's one way you could do that sort of thing. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
I was going to say, I think it's actually extremely common for technician access, where you say, hey, the technicians, they come into the hospital and they authenticate separately through the cloud and push down to the device. So that way, that your technician is on site, standing in front of it, and then you can centrally distribute that access. And under no other circumstances are you allowing, the kind of service access that might cause patient harm or change settings, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. Right. And one thing I've seen in the past is like, well, we put a password on the admin menu, right? It's like 1, 2, 3, 4. It's like, okay, well, that's not, that can be shared. There's no actual like check that it's going back to the database, that this person has authenticated to a truly secure service, that they're part of some kind of Active Directory. There's nothing there, right? It's just a 1, 2, 3, 4, and that is not enough. And that's, again, that comes to the device manufacturer, what they implement there. But then you could push down from the cloud and say that sort of thing. In terms of who can actually authorize this to happen, right? Golioth has API keys in order to control the REST API. That's ultimately going to be how a lot of external applications are going to control devices out in the field. And so we have, a full API key scheme in order to securely manage that sort of thing. You can reject keys and that, for different apps and devices, and have different levels of capabilities on the cloud side. But if you wanted to have a doctor who had just a normal phone that's talking back up to the cloud and then maybe down to the device that's sitting next to them, that is, the fact that the doctor can or cannot activate a pump that's sitting right next to them, that is up to the maker of that app, right? They're checking the Active Directory, they're checking the user permissions for that sort of thing. And then because that app has access to the REST API through the API keys, then that sort of thing is transited. And I think it's always going to be this kind of multiple layers, multiple stakeholders, software, firmware, app developer, all of these things. You need to be thinking about this from the Golioth perspective. We're from the cloud down to the device. And if someone has an API key for the Golioth cloud and they know which device to talk to, they are allowed to do that sort of thing.
So the last one is the integrity. And this is actually one of the most important parts of it, because if we can't trust ourselves, we can't trust, we can't know that we've done a good job implementing all the other things that we trust. So HIKVision has, a few years ago, they had this magic string that was included on their devices, and it allowed you to bypass the authentication, the firmware signing, and as a result of that, hundreds of thousands of cameras were hijacked for botnets. And this required owners to manually go to the camera, unplug it, reflash the devices, and in order to remediate and send it out. And it's really an example that's so important about why this kind of integrity is important. This is an example of like digital integrity, where we need to make sure that you can't load new firmware like this enabled you to do that lets you do bad stuff, things that you never intended. It's just kind of one of those aspects of integrity.
I think just on the one of my earlier points too, of like, it's not just the hardware, right? I'm sure, it was not done maliciously, but I'm sure at some point, right, the hardware maker, right, might have been separate from the software maker, and they said, well, we need some way to change all of the admin settings, and they put this string in there. Who would ever find this? Who would ever decompile the firmware? Who would ever do this sort of thing? And the thing is, if you don't take it out, if you don't have it out, if you don't have this, if you're not thinking about this full end-to-end, how things will be used at the beginning, it can be really problematic. So the need here, you must support secure boot, tamper resistance, unique cryptographic keys, and secure backup/restore. In terms of how Golioth does this, so Golioth requires a unique device record. So in terms of like unique cryptographic keys, you can't have multiple devices sending on the same certificate, the same key, that sort of thing. That won't work there. In terms of secure boot, Golioth doesn't actually enable secure boot because that is up to the device manufacturer. But we can send device firmware packages down over the link. It will be encrypted all the way down. And that can be the firmware image itself can be encrypted so that Golioth never has any knowledge of what's going on inside that firmware package. And ultimately, it's up to the device maker to validate it on boot. Right? We can load it in. We can help you show how to load it into memory. But then when it reads it back out of memory to boot up, you need to do key checking and that sort of thing on that image. So really, a lot of this stuff is up to the device manufacturers. In terms of the ability to restore, I mentioned the setting service as well. When a device boots up, it will actually go out and query settings. You can just set those all back to default as well. So there is audit and persistence of settings across time as well.
And I think one of the important parts of integrity is not just on boot self-integrity. You have to get your firmware updates to the device with integrity and make sure that those channels are encrypted and make sure that they're authenticated and all those things. So
yeah, that's right.
So I think we have time for a few questions here. Let's see. I think does the Cyber Trust Mark consider medical devices for home use as consumer devices? And the answer is kind of no, with an asterisk. The Cyber Trust Mark has a specific carve out for medical devices regulated by the FDA. So, however, lots of devices may not actually fall under that category. So if you're talking about home health or support or wellness, those devices will fall under the CRA if there are not the CRA, I should say the Cyber Trust Mark, if they
CTM.
are
Yeah.
if they are if they are connected devices. Let's see. I think there's a question.
And that would be like someone using like a therapeutic device.
Yeah.
You're saying that isn't
exactly right.
class 1, 2, 3, but
yeah. I think there was a question about is Golioth, like what kind of solution is Golioth? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, Golioth is primarily a cloud solution, and so if you look at kind of under the hood, often devices are talking back again securely up to our CoAP backend. So they're DTLS encrypted all the way up, and we offer these different endpoints and services on the cloud side. Now, in terms of me as a hardware person, that's not that useful to me because I would have to go and re-implement all this stuff. Golioth also has a open source firmware SDK, which basically gives both examples, but then all of the tooling that's necessary to actually for device makers to go and talk to those cloud side services, because that's really critical. If you just have the cloud side services, okay, I got to go rewrite all this stuff, in Zephyr or FreeRTOS or similar. That stuff is all open source. You can go and do that right now, but often you'll see lots of examples from me and my coworkers showing a device talking end to end. So, for example, this is a cellular device. This is the Thingy91X. This thing on day one has over-the-air updates. It's able to stream its sensor data up. I can turn LEDs on and off using our setting service. I could send commands down to the device using something called remote procedure calls. And ultimately, this is a example hardware like this talking up to the cloud kind of shows you that full end-to-end device to cloud, and then whatever you want to do with that data once it's on the cloud.
Yeah, I think there's another question about how important is the physical tamper resistance for devices. It's actually quite important, because if you can't trust the hardware you run on, all the software in the world isn't going to save you. So the FDA likes to see that you have tamper-resistant seals over the openings for your device to make sure that your clinicians, your technicians can tell if something has been tampered with. Because ultimately, you could always open the box and replace everything with your own hardware or software that could be harmful.
Ship of Theseus hardware, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The nice thing is it's versus everything else we've talked today, it's by far the easiest. You tell your manufacturing engineers, hey, we got to put these stickers over everything. That's the best remediation. Versus
I do think you can also have various forms of intrusion detection as well. You could have it both on firmware side, but even like I said, light detection. Once a case is buttoned up, as soon as it sees light, it means somebody's probably in there. There's similar, switches. There's a whole field of tamper. Actually, there's a whole section at DEF CON of the tamper-resistant village, I believe.
Yep.
And
the tamper village.
basically, trying to bypass that sort of thing from a reverse engineer context. But you could go there and learn what does and doesn't work as well. And so you could start to implement these things. And it's kind of like door locks on your house, right? Not every lock is going to keep everybody out, but if you start having this connectivity in there as well, you can also tell when that door lock has turned. And that might be enough from being able to tell that there's been some kind of bad behavior, and then either discounting that data or sending someone out to fix it.
And I think maybe their last one for today is we asked about how does the CRA apply to medical devices? And I think the answer is the CRA does not apply to medical devices that are under the MDR, the European medical device regulations. But the same kind of carve-outs apply, where if you don't fall under that as a therapeutic device, something like that, you are required to follow the CRA guidance. Or, for example, some people cross-list products as both recreational and medical devices, that kind of thing. So